Good afternoon, everyone. Whoa. Sorry for that. If you were falling asleep, hopefully you've woken up by now. Hopefully I won't be putting you to sleep over the course of the next hour and 15 minutes. And good afternoon. I'm Zach. I'm a training officer with FSA. I've actually only been at the department about 2.5 years after about 20 at schools. So it still feels a little odd to be on this side of the podium talking to you instead of attending the conference and listening to people like me talk. But thank you for coming to this session about dealing with administering aid for transfer students. And first, I would actually like to ask, please, with a show of hands, how many of you were here last year for the transfer student presentation? Okay, that's a fair number, and I think says something about the nature of this topic. I've already joked with a couple of you that all of the changes are at the very, very end. So if you need to take a little break, the beginning is the time to do that. I also think if you're willing to go along with this, I'd like to have you be a guinea pig group. Last year, we had no time for questions. We butt up right against the very end of the session, and there was no time to talk to anyone or get questions answered. Some of the material at the end is pretty challenging, and again, it has changed in the last year, so for some of you, there'll even be that layer on top of it, and I'd really like to have some time for questions. Are you willing for me to try a short Q&A period after each section of the presentation? Okay. I know you don't necessarily know what that means yet because you haven't seen it unless you printed it out, but we're going to give it a shot anyway because the earlier parts of the presentation are a little bit more straightforward, so I think we can probably breeze through those a little more readily. And so with that, there are a number of things we're going to talk about today. First, some general issues that might arise at your school as far as Title IV applies directly to transfer students. We'll talk about the transfer monitoring process, and then get into kind of the nitty-gritty of awarding Pell, awarding direct loans, and then the really fun topic of dealing with R2T4 and overlapping periods. Do many of you know what I mean by overlapping periods? This is why we want question time. It is a very convoluted issue. And again, now it's actually more convoluted. Yay. So that's why I want to leave that time. So with that, I will launch in just to remind you of our transfer monitoring process. This is really, at its essence, just a process whereby you can go in to the NSLDS system through the Financial Aid Professional Access, tell us who you want to monitor, and then we will be alerting you to any changes in that student's or those students' financial aid histories, since of course, as those may be changing at their previous school, if they're coming right to your school, that could impact then what you would be able to award that student. This process is actually required for your transfer students. This is really just a visual. Not much to say about that. If you are not currently responsible, or if you don't just know a lot about the transfer monitoring process, every school does have a profile that needs to be set up, and that is the actual first step of getting this to work out. We'll talk about some of those features. The first step, though, once you have a profile set up, is to tell us who you want us to monitor. You can submit a batch file, or as I mentioned a moment ago, you can access the NSLDS Financial Aid Professional website to input an actual list of students. Here's another visual. We would also like you to add, to the extent you were able to identify them, anyone who maybe has received Title IV aid in the past and is now at your school, whether they are receiving aid or not. If they're receiving aid at your school, that will already be taken care of. But if they're not receiving aid at your school, this is a way to get them onto your enrollment roster for NSLDS reporting process. Different, of course, from transfer monitoring, but it's important nonetheless. Then once you have told us who these students are, we will then monitor them, essentially, for as long as you have told us to, which can be anywhere from 30 to 120 days, where we will keep tabs on that student's history and we will alert you if something has happened that might affect their eligibility, such as when there is a change in a previously awarded loan or grant at a previous school, something new, as the case may be, or something gets canceled, any number of things like that. We will also actually email the designated individual at your school that this is happening, so you might be alerted to it in a couple of different ways. Once you have added someone to the list, all we ask is that you wait 7 days before doing anything with that student's aid, essentially. Once 7 days have passed, you have fulfilled your transfer monitoring obligation and can go ahead and disperse aid accordingly. And you actually don't have to abide by that 7-day requirement if you either have gone out to NSLDS directly to check at the time of disbursement to see what that student's aid history looks like, or we tell you about a change before that 7 days is up. In either of those cases, you may disperse earlier than 7 days. If you have followed all these procedures, you waited your 7 days or whatever the case may be, maybe you got to have the exception, when you follow those procedures, if something changes later and the student becomes ineligible for something you have given them, this is another case for those of you who were in the general session this morning when we talked about school responsibility versus student responsibility. This is actually a student's responsibility to repay. If you have done all these things, you added them to the list, you waited the 7 days, and you find out a month later after you've made a disbursement, something significant has happened, it's actually on the student. With just a reminder that if this is something like a Title IV grant where there might be an overpayment situation created, you always do, of course, have the option of repaying that on the student's behalf or making arrangements with them, as always. Am I moving too fast through all of this? Good, okay. Thank you. Switching topics a little bit, to remind you, I actually don't know, I would love to hear it if any of you have actually done this, but it is kind of an unusual provision related to transfer students, that if another school has already verified that student for that award year, and you're obviously aiding them from that same award year, that school has communicated with you the fact that they have previously verified the student and what ICER transaction was verified. You do not need to verify them at your school. Have any of you actually used this and gotten documentation from another school before? Okay, I was just curious. Like, I would love it if someone actually said yes. You can fake it, it's okay. We'll see it when. And of course, SAP. All we really say regulatorily when it comes to SAP and transfer students is just that you will need to have some provisions in your institutional policies about how transfer students' SAP is going to be monitored, because you actually have some options here. When you are transferring hours for that student from another institution, for SAP purposes, you actually can essentially look at all credits that might transfer. You can choose to look just at credits that transfer in that are specific to that student's program. We would actually recommend the latter because it is better for the student. Certainly, at minimum, you have to look at credits as attempted and completed that were transferred in and do apply to the student's program, but you can use more if you like. You also have the option as to whether transferred credit does or does not impact that student's GPA. So you could have it not affected, or you could actually have the GPA of the transferred courses impact. But either way, these things just have to be defined in your SAP policy and therefore disclosed to students accordingly. All right. Does anyone have any questions about that? Do we need to pause? All right. There are a few things I would really like to reinforce about Pell, because some of these things are very different from what we'll be talking about in a few minutes when we talk about direct loans. The first big one is that Pell is always going to be based on an award year basis. So we're looking specifically at the July 1st to June 30th award year that we have defined. Direct loans are actually not administrated on an award year basis. So that is big point number one. Big point number two is that Pell is always treated proportionally when you are dealing with a transfer student. So in this particular example that you're seeing, you're going to look at the amount that was dispersed at the prior school versus the Pell scheduled award at the prior school to see what portion of the scheduled award has been used. Therefore, it's also important to note, don't forget, that they may have a different scheduled award at your school. You might perform professional judgment. Maybe now that they're coming to your school, they've been selected for verification. Any number of things could happen whereby they have a different EFC for you than they did at their prior school. So they could actually have two separate scheduled awards. But first, we're going to look at what's happened at that prior school. Oops, sorry. In this case, we know what they received at the prior school, which was $34.89. They had a scheduled award of $58.15, meaning that they had used 60% of that award at the prior school. So what do they have left for you? 40. So they have 40% of your scheduled award left. So again, we're always going to be looking at this proportionally. The third big one, which I think is a little bit hard to verbalize, is actually dealing with this last set of bullet points on your slide. Once you know what is left to them, you will actually calculate what their scheduled Pell amount would be per payment period, and you actually are going to give them that amount per payment period until it runs out, up to whatever proportion it is they're eligible for. We'll show you some visual examples because I think that will help. In this case, so we know now they have 40% at your school left, 40% of their scheduled award. Conveniently for us today, you have the same scheduled award as the prior school. 40% of that is $23.26. To be clear, if you know that you have the same scheduled award as the prior school, you can just do the math and subtract the dollar figure that they received at the prior school from their scheduled award, just so you know. So we know, again, we have 23.26. We're going to look at a couple of different kinds of transfer situations and how Pell applies here. So in this particular case, we have just like a standard term institution. The student is starting there in the spring. Because this is a standard term institution, we're assuming in this case that they have like just a fall and a spring term. So just 2 payment periods, we would take the scheduled award divided by 2. Very simple. So $29.08 per period. This is a much more complicated version of what I just told you. This is the case where I think the visual representation may not actually help with understanding what has happened. This is a case, I guess what's curious about it is that this is a student who's come from a quarter school to a semester-based school. They're starting in spring. I guess maybe that's curious, but it doesn't change the fact that based on your calculations at the school, they would have a payment period disbursement of $29.08. They only have $23.26 left. So for spring, they're going to get $23.26, the lesser of those two. Now we will look at it from a quarter perspective. I will bring up the confusing visual again. In this case, they're going from a quarter school to your school, which is, in this case, a quarter school. They still have the same amount, $23.26. We've calculated the payment a little bit differently. You will find that there are numerical errors on this slide. You will find that in a few slides, actually. It is amusing to know how many people, and I mean like at least 12 of us, that looked at this and didn't notice it. That is how proofreading goes. So please ignore scheduled award equals 5,500. That is not true. Scheduled award was 58.15, like we've been talking about this whole time. Because this is a quarter school and there are 3 quarters, in this case, we would just take the 58.15 award, divide it by 3 payment periods, and arrive at 1938. Now this comes back to what I was talking about actually awarding whatever they're scheduled to receive per payment period until you run out of money. Because in this case, their first quarter at your school is winter. Their scheduled amount for that payment period is 1938, so they get that full 1938. That's what they're scheduled for. Then when they return for the spring quarter following that, all they have left is 388 of that 2326 total of their full scheduled award that they still had available. I think it can be very tempting because it feels more logical actually to take that 2326 and just divide it by 2 because they have 2 payment periods at your school left for that year. So this is a little bit counterintuitive. It is a special thing with Pell. Do a lot of you here have clock hour programs, just so that I know? Okay, most of you, that's good. So this is actually a pretty similar concept. In this case, we're dealing with a 600-hour program. So this is a program that's actually less than an academic year long, because in this case, the school has an academic year of 900 hours instead. So each payment period, 2 payment periods over that 600 clock hour program, 300 hours per payment period, conveniently calculates to the same amount that we have with our quarters, because it's 1/3 of a year, 1938 per payment period. So the situation, as you will see, is very, very much the same in this particular case. For that first 300-hour payment period at your school, they get that full 1938. Then for that second payment period, unfortunately, all they have left is the 388. It's like playing Where's Waldo. The mistake on this slide is that we say 1833 in the lower right-hand corner. If you want to change that on your presentation, if you printed it out, please feel free. But overall, a very, very similar kind of scenario. It is different, however. I will gloss over this particular slide back to the visual here. It is very different if you're dealing, though, with a crossover term. So again, because Pell is driven by award year, July 1 to June 30th, if you have a term or a payment period that crosses over that July 1st barrier, you get to pick what year you're going to take Pell from, what award year you're going to take Pell from. So interestingly, in this kind of case, it doesn't always work out this neatly, please know, because a scheduled award would change from one year to the next, but we're going to say, to make the math easier, that in 1617, there was a scheduled award of 5815, and in 2017-18, there was a scheduled award of the same amount, 5815. This would not happen in reality. It just makes it simpler. So, for this first payment period, if you recall, we had already calculated their scheduled amount as 1938. If we continue to pull everything from the 2016-17 year, they'd only have that little 388 left over for the second payment period. But because that second payment period crosses over July 1st, you get to pick, and if you want, you can then take that from the 2017-18 year. And because we unrealistically made those scheduled awards exactly the same, they still get 1938 per payment period. This time they get that whole amount. So a little bit of an advantage here, perhaps, if you're dealing with a crossover situation. Would anyone like to ask some questions about Pell? If you do have a question, because this is being broadcast, I need to ask, please, that you use the microphone. Just to put you on the spot.
Date myself, but does all of this wipe out the PGMR where I used to have to email the schools and ask them when a student started and stopped? And does all of the percentage, the 600%, does all of this overwrite all of that? I don't have to do that anymore?
It's actually, unfortunately, no, it definitely does not get rid of that. We're actually dealing with 2 slightly different issues. This, I think, oh, I'm back, okay. Thank you, Tony. In this particular kind of scenario, we're kind of assuming everyone has done what we would hope that they would be doing, which is the previous school went and closed out Pell essentially for that year. They canceled any future disbursements, et cetera. It is still possible that you might get notified that another school has Pell originated for the same period in a case like this, and you may have to reach out to them. So yes, that is still true. Hopefully all it means for the other school is, oh, whoops, we forgot to cancel a disbursement. Because that is easily solved. I know it is not always an easily solvable situation. Anybody else? All right. Thank you. And I wish I had good news for you on that one. So that is Pell. I personally think Pell is pretty simple, actually, relatively speaking. Maybe simple is the wrong word. These things are really relative because this gets harder. For direct loan purposes, although when you set up a direct loan in the COD system, it is of course assigned to an award year. But when you're looking at that student's eligibility, the award year is kind of irrelevant. You're looking at an annual loan limit, and for direct loans, the annual period we're talking about is actually your Title IV defined academic year. Does everyone know what your Title IV defined academic year is? Okay. That is very good. So this is a slightly different approach, and you can already kind of see the foreshadowing of what's coming. Because direct loans are awarded on an academic year basis, Pell is awarded on an award year basis. These are not the same, and so we might end up occasionally with some mismatches in terms of periods, which is what we're kind of building up to here. This is just to reiterate our defined minimums. Again, you get to define whatever that year is as long as it at least meets our minimum standard, just as a reference. This is mostly just refresher about minimum loan periods. If you are a certain type of program that is a credit hour and standard term, or what we like to call Sinanwa programs, which mean non-standard term with substantially equal terms that are at least 9 weeks in length. I actually inadvertently came up with one earlier today talking with someone at our booth, and I called them non-stantial nines. So I'm hoping that will catch on and we can get rid of Sinanwa. If you have one of those terms, though, you do have the option of making a single term loan. Other types of calendars, you're always awarding loans essentially based on an academic year, or if, say, you have a program that's a year and some portion long, you might be awarding just on that remaining portion, but those single payment period loans won't happen anymore. But what happens when students transfer and their academic year at whatever school they're coming from has not ended when they begin at your school? This is really the root of the problem here with direct loans. First, we'll talk a little bit about the issue of reporting years when you're originating loans. If you are a credit hour program dealing with standard terms or non-stantial nines, as the case may be, you can just report the academic year at your institution as you would normally. So that's a little bit more clear-cut. If you have a different type of program, such as a non-term or clock hour program, essentially what you're left with is finishing out that prior school's academic year. The reason this is because that student's annual loan eligibility, again, is tied to that academic year, so they can't access a new loan limit until that year is over. And in this case, the year just happens to have started somewhere else. And they're just finishing up with you. I only heard one sigh. That was good. That means you're in good spirits today. Again, and I think this is something probably most of you know, you can find those prior schools' academic year dates by looking in COD as a general rule, because they will have had to report it when they originated and dispersed the loan. So you should be able to find it in COD. Part of the reason we are talking about this a little bit more is actually because of the SULA calculations around the 150% subsidized limit. We want to be sure that those students are getting all they are entitled to, and we all know that is less than they used to be entitled to in some respects. So we want to be sure those calculations are accurate, which is why this actually matters. So I'm going to run through a few examples at increasing levels of complexity. This is the nice, simple example where we have a credit hour standard term school, or program, as the case may be. Just so that you know, blue is going to be that student's current enrollment. So at the top, the blue is where they were enrolled at the previous school. The blue at the bottom is their enrollment at your school. Those green periods are your defined academic year periods. going by dates. So that student was at school 1 from August to December at the first school, withdrew and then transferred to your school to start this new year. In this particular case, we're dealing with a borrower-based year to illustrate the example. So at your school, we would essentially be saying that student is doing something like a spring-summer year at your school. I know I said when you're reporting academic year dates, you can just go ahead and report the January 5th to August 21st year, and that is correct. But it doesn't mean, unfortunately, you can completely ignore what the student received at the prior school. You just don't have to worry about it a lot. So if we assume they are a first-year student, in this case at both schools, your schools and the prior one, so they already got half of that. They got the $1,750 at the prior school and came to you. And again, they're starting a new year, technically, with you. You give them $1,750 as well. But that is all you can give them until the blue period is over. It probably won't matter because that's probably the end of your spring anyway. And you're not looking at a new disbursement until the following term, so it probably doesn't affect you. But depending on how disbursements are scheduled and your term schedule and all of those kinds of things, it could have an impact. So again, at the second school, they can only receive $1,750 because they already got $1,750 at the old school, totaling $3,500. Again, we're just talking about subsidized here. Totaling $3,500 for that full academic year. Now, something magical happens when they get past your spring. Now they are in a new year at your school, but not the beginning of a new year. They're actually going to still just be staying in the year you initially reported, January to August. So they're still getting $3,500 for that January to August period. Our limitation is just that they can't get more than that $1,750 until the prior year ends. But they still get a whole $3,500 for that year. Did that more or less make sense? Maybe? All right. We hope, anyway. It's very convoluted. So you have to care, but only sort of care with this type of school. But here's where it actually can have a little bit more impact, is again, the last case, the student conveniently was a first-year person in the previous program, and they were a first-year person at your school, but they may have been at a different grade level when they withdrew and transferred to your school. So in a case like this student was a second-year student, so they had subsidized eligibility of $4,500 for the year. They transfer into you. You did not opt to accept transfer, so they're starting your program as a first-year student. Now suddenly you actually do have to care. It's a little bit funky in this particular case, because now what we're looking at is that the grade level is different. They were second year before, they're first year with you, and what's their limit as a first year student? $3,500. They've already received $2,250, so they can only get up to that $3,500 until that prior year ends. Once it's over, clean slate, and they can get the rest of their $3,500. Their second $3,500. Does this make sense to you? Not a judgment, I just want to be sure you get it. Okay. And we're going to go a little bit simpler. Oh, yes, please. Although I'm sorry, I do have to ask you to use the microphone. Or I can repeat your question if I can hear you. Is there an automatic UEH flag? Was that your question? Far be it for me to say what will trigger the flag. No, I know we have the rules around that. Not necessarily. If that school, or that student rather, had hopped institutions a little bit in that time, and had 3 or 4 in a 2-year period, for example, yes, that might trigger it. But only if, just with the 2 schools, it probably, at worst, would trigger a number 2. And even then, not necessarily. It is good, yes. And hopefully this isn't a student that is going from one to the next to the next. Because, that if that student had been at 3 different schools, they could still be in an academic year from school 1 and your school 3, and this gets really, really kooky. Did you have a question, Paul, too?
I'm getting confused.
Yes, it should be. I wasn't kidding. This is a game to see all of the things. At least I can say this was not me that missed them. At least I can say that, yes, this student did not find a way to go back in time. They would not need any education if they could do that. And I encourage you to point those things out because it actually keeps it a little lighter. So that's good. Thank you. So in this case, they're going into a clock hour program. So just slightly different. It's not all going to be just credit hour, standard term type thing, but actually still pretty straightforward. They receive $17.50 at that prior school. They start the 2-year clock hour program. They get their $17.50 of that remaining academic year until the previous year ends on May 10th from that prior school. What's a little different, and this will kind of illustrate this, is that, of course, this is now a clock hour program. And before, as I said, when we're reporting academic years, if you're a credit hour, standard term, et cetera, type of school, you can just report the academic year that you have. And once that old school's year is over, it's kind of like nothing is different for the transfer student. Clock hour programs, not the same. Will be a little different. This is kind of combining a couple of issues here. So they were a second year student at the prior school, transferred into your school to start a 1-year program. Accepting credits is sort of irrelevant here because it's a 1-year program, so they will never be more than a first-year student, no matter what. So they can only get the remainder of your grade level, 3,500, what's left over, up to 3,500, until that prior school's year ends, which it does in May. So because this is a clock hour program now, you finished out that old year, now the student actually starts a new academic year altogether for direct loan purposes. Again, with credit hour schools, you kind of got to just abide by your initial year. Now you can't abide by it anymore, so they're starting a whole new year. In this particular case, after the prior school's year ends, you see that they have 300 hours and 10 weeks left over in their program. This is not going to be a whole academic year. I think we decided the school used a 900-hour academic year, so what they have left is just 300 hours. They have a third of a year left. So now we actually have to prorate their loan again because it's a remaining period of study shorter than an academic year in length. So they got the $1,250 for that first period of time, and then they'll get this prorated amount, $1,167, for that remaining period of study. So this does get a lot funkier when we're dealing with clock hour programs. It's not in the presentation, but I do want to throw out there too, that when we're dealing with these sort of overlapping periods and you're finishing out another school's academic year, it does happen that you might have an academic year remaining period that's something like 2 weeks long or less. I actually was just working with a school that had a 5-day overlap. Unfortunately, that still does exist as a loan period at your school if you are dealing with a clock hour program. And you will have to come up with some appropriate cost of attendance for that tiny little period, some appropriate EFC for that tiny little period to package them. Because if you look in the handbook, we will say they can get up to this maximum left over. That doesn't mean they're actually eligible necessarily for that whole amount. It would be just like packaging for any other period. So you'll use the cost for that period, EFC for that period. If you are not exempt, you may still have to make 2 disbursements for that period. Fun stuff. Yes. Yep. and quite possibly both, where you have, well, you're right, the two disbursements in the short period, and then 2 more in the following period, and so on, and it snowballs from there. Oops, sorry. I didn't want to skip this example. This is yet another kind of interesting instance. The last program we were talking about, that clock hour program, was a 1-year program, so it was at least a year long. Now, this is a case of a student transferring into a clock hour program that is shorter than a year to begin with. So you would already have to prorate anyway because it's shorter than an academic year long. What we're saying in this case, so they had $1,750 from the prior school, they can get additional $1,750, the remainder of that $3,500, up to the time that prior school's academic year ends. And then, as we said before, they're starting a new loan period here for the remaining portion of their program. But because that program already had to be prorated, whether this was a transfer student or not, because it was shorter than an academic year, we say they could never receive more than that prorated amount that they would have had if they were not a transfer student. So this was a 600-hour program. When we prorate, the maximum amount that student could receive is $23.33. So because they get $750, we're going to assume they were eligible for that maximum. They get the $1,750 up to the point the prior school's year ends. They can only get a total of $23.33, so all they have left over for that remaining portion is $583. Yes?
So what if at school A, the loan period ends, let's say, January 5th, and at school B, the student actually starts on January 2nd? So you have a slight overlap in the loan period. What do you do in school B?
You give them a loan for $10. I'm mostly kidding, but I'm not entirely kidding. Because there is that overlap, we don't say anywhere that overlap has a minimum length. So they actually are entitled, assuming they still do have remaining eligibility, they are still entitled to a very short loan period's worth of loan,
Okay.
which could be a ridiculously small amount.
So in that scenario, school B would have, like a 5-day loan period, and then,
Yeah.
okay.
Hopefully this isn't coming up a lot, but it does come up.
How do you address the academic progress when you have that at the front end of there and you only have 5 days and you've dispersed for that loan period and now you're going into another academic year? Wouldn't you have to be checking some kind of academic progress before they can get their next disbursement?
Fortunately, no.
Okay.
Depending, as you do have an option like in the clock hour program, whether you want to review when they're scheduled to complete hours or when they do complete hours or when they successfully complete hours. But either way, you're looking at some kind of completion of half of the hours and half of the weeks. So that can still be based on when they actually started your program. And some of that may actually become clearer too as we move into the next section, because then we have payment periods where you would be probably reviewing for SAP that do not jibe with this.
Okay. Thank you.
But come back if you have further questions too. Did this make relatively decent sense? Again, not a judgment, just okay. Because now we have actually time. We have a lot of time. Oh, yes, you did have a question. I just want to be sure I can repeat it. I can also repeat it if you don't want to go to the mic. Okay. It's all right, we have time. That's good.
First of all, I'm from a non-standard term school.
Okay.
So the example is I have a student who was at a previous institution in the June semester, as far as they're concerned. And their year-end period ended in July, it was like July 16th of 2016. Ours began on July 1st, 2016. They dispersed a certain amount to the student in June, but then on July 7th, they dispersed $107 to a student. The prior school did. And then we also, and this is for an unsub, so it's a grad student. We disperse, so say that we were going to disperse just the regular amount for, and this particular student was $51.25 for the grad student, for the first term. That started July 1st. So my question is there a problem with that?
Well, I have to start by saying,
Wow.
this assumes I understand the
Okay.
question. But I think I have the details. You might not want to leave, I don't know. But I can hear you from here, if you don't feel like standing. I actually have to ask you a question back.
Okay,
If you have non-standard terms, are they substantially equal?
yes,
Okay. And for any who are not familiar, substantially equal just means no more than 2 weeks different than any other term. Are they at least 9 weeks long?
yes,
Yay. Because in that case, it is like these credit hour kind of standard term type institutions we're looking at, where you can report the academic year that you have starting, you said July 1st? Starting on July 1st, that student they just can't get more than whatever was left over from that prior school's year until it's over, which fortunately is only 2 weeks in.
right, okay,
So if you were going to give them, I'll have to use just fake dollars now.
okay,
But if you were going to give them $5,000 for that term, for example, and they had already received, I don't know a good way to put it. Let's say they'd already received $3,000 from that prior school. It just means you may not be able to give them that full $5,000 until July 17th.
okay,
Or you could give them $2,000 and then give them another disbursement later to come to your normal amount. But that's really all it would mean. Or just wait. Yes. Right. So you could break it up to get to the same amount you would have given them anyway, if you wanted to. Or again, you could just wait until the year was over, since it's only 2 weeks. If that doesn't create a problem for the student, would be an option for you as well. So fortunately, because your terms are non-standard, non-substantially, non-standard, substantially equal, and at least 9 weeks, it's much simpler. Because then too, for anyone who is not aware, if their non-standard terms had not been substantially equal in 9 weeks, they would be treated essentially like a clock hour program for direct loan purposes. So the clock hour-y stuff would actually apply to them. They're only off the hook because those terms are at least 9 weeks and substantially equal. It's hard to know how even to talk about this. But again, as I mentioned a little bit ago, when we were talking about Pell Grants being driven by award year, direct loans being driven by academic year, and now we know when people are leaving other institutions and coming to you, you may have overlapping academic years. So it actually is not a big leap to say that that student's academic year for direct loan purposes may not align with Pell purposes. This creates some interesting scenarios. In general, in this case, we're going to talk about R2T4 because that's when the scenarios get even more interesting. And that is because the rules essentially say, when we talk about completing an R2T4 calculation, that if you are doing it by payment period, the payment period has to meet the standards in the Code of Federal Regulations, 668.4, of what a payment period is. In this case, that payment period represents half the number of hours and half the number of weeks in a school's or program's academic year. That may or may not, again, coincide very neatly with that student's direct loan periods. So you may have a payment period for direct loan purposes that does not meet the definition of payment period in 668.4. And in fact, it is probably easier, rather than talking about all of this text, to actually go to the visual in this case. And we will talk about the text instead, because this, I think, is a good representation of what happens in a case like this. So the student comes to your school and starts on August 24th, that's the blue, you're in the position of having to finish out a prior academic year from the prior school for direct loan purposes, which is this first little orange loan period here with a disbursement date of September 14th. However, since this blue is meant to represent actual scheduled amounts of time in this program, in this clock hour program, as you can see, that little abbreviated loan period at the beginning does not meet the definition of half the hours and half the weeks in the program. That's what the blue period represents. So we already have this misalignment here. What makes this so challenging for R2T4, I think anyway, is really trying to make that determination of what was aid that was dispersed, what was aid that could have been dispersed. How does this work when we're looking at a payment period that doesn't meet the definition for loan purposes in this case? So this first blue period is what we're going to have to look at. The student has withdrawn on September 28th, so they withdrew 2 weeks after funds were dispersed for this abbreviated loan. Is everybody with me? Okay. The dates are almost kind of irrelevant. That's why I wanted to go to the visual, because I think it actually is easier to follow. So in this case, you know that the student got most of the way through that abbreviated period, but they didn't actually complete it. And you know, though, what was dispersed. That is a little more straightforward. You had a disbursement on September 14th of Pell and direct loan. Pell is not an issue in this particular case because it was all dispersed for that same payment period, pretty cut and dry. Not so for direct loans. In this particular case, if we were to say, for example, that you had originated the loan going from whatever that is, October to March, those second two orange blobs, if you had already originated that, you would actually need to count that as aid that could have been dispersed in the R2T4 calculation because it exists within the blue payment period. I'm going to keep calling it the blue payment period. We tend to call it the Pell payment period a lot, but you don't necessarily have Pell depending on the programs that you're offering. So we don't necessarily want to call it the Pell payment period, just that compliant payment period with 668.4. So if you had not originated that second loan, it does not exist for the sake of the R2T4 calculation because it could not have been dispersed during that payment period. You hadn't originated it when the student had withdrawn. So even in like a normal scenario, this wouldn't be aid that could have been dispersed because you hadn't originated the loan. If you had originated it, you would then lose that portion that is attributable to the blue payment period. This, for those of you that were here last year, this is new. We got guidance literally like the day of the presentation last year on transfer students and how this would work. This is not how it ended up working. This is different. So when they ended up moving the guidance to the student aid handbook, this is what it looked like. This is not what we said last year. So this is different. So what we're actually looking at again is that little bracketed area, assuming you originated the loan, aid that could have been dispersed would include that portion of that loan that overlaps the blue period. How do we figure out what that portion is? Well, we look at scheduled days, in this case, for the student. We are just telling you that the blue payment period is 107 days long, and that overlap of the second loan is 47 days into the blue period. So we've gone from sighing to laughter. When we do the math, that ends up at 52.34%. It actually ends up at $1,831.90. I have rounded it up to $1,832. The reason I'm even making a point about rounding is something we don't have an answer on yet, actually. If you were to look in chapter 5, or volume 5 of the FSA handbook, there is a whole example of something like this in there. What they did, though, was unusual. Where they had this fraction, 56 divided by 107, they took that fraction, got 52.34%. Their numbers were actually different, but since that's what you're looking at. So 52.34%, they rounded that to 52%, and then multiplied it by the loan amount to find the amount. We are not sure that is going to be correct, but if this happens to you, I would suggest following what the handbook says. Or this presentation says. They also saw this. So one of these two things may be right, but at least you have it in, well, I've got to be honest, but at least you have it in writing somewhere. One of these two things are probably safe for you until and unless we have a final picture. And if you ever need to follow up, of course, don't hesitate ever to follow up with I or someone else to see if we ever got final word, as we have not so far. That is, it is only if the loan isn't originated that you would include it as aid that could have been dispersed. Something I don't think I mentioned. Yeah, I did not mention there, so I'm glad you continued the conversation on that. Yes, it is aid that could have been dispersed for the purposes of doing the calculation, but the student never actually got so far as to begin that second loan period. So yes, it's aid that could have been dispersed when you do the math, but you could never actually disperse it to the student. It's one of those aid that could be dispersed that can never be dispersed situations. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. So another example, it's the same except for the fact that the student has withdrawn here a little bit later on November 5th, so they've actually begun the second loan period in this case. They still haven't completed the first blue payment period.
To confuse us more, November 5th, 2015.
Is there another date?
Yeah. Student withdraws School B on November 5th, 2015.
Oh,
A year before the
a year before. So this is a moot point, and we can just skip this example. Thank you. This is good. I found only this morning, I only found 2 of these, so this is helpful for the future. Oh, yes. Yep. We don't really say in this example, so I'm going to just assume that it's an academic year. I definitely see your point, which is if we assume that loan number 2 is an academic year in length, then the first payment period would actually coincide with the definition of 668.4. And that is absolutely true. It's just that unfortunately, because of when the student started, those are the payment periods we're concerned about. Because actually the student, if we look at it maybe in a similar sort of way, the student withdrawing here in November, taking your example, is in 2 different 668.4 payment periods. So we're going to take the one that's driven by when the student actually began attendance at your school. The Pell one will drive it, yes. Doesn't matter. That's kind of what I meant before when I said we tend to call it the Pell payment period, but we try to move away from that because it doesn't actually matter if they have Pell or not. So it's sort of more driven by their actual beginning of attendance than anything else in this case. Is what, based on when that student began, the payment period then that's going to take priority is the one that began on their first day of attendance, not the loan period that started later. There we go. We can call it the imputed payment period. Yep. So in this particular case, as you can see, our first scheduled disbursement of the second loan was October 26th. The student withdrew in early November, so you have already dispersed disbursement number 1 of the second loan here. The student withdraws. So in this case, now we have aid that has been dispersed. This is no longer aid that could have been dispersed. It was dispersed. So now what we're looking at in the calculation as aid dispersed is going to be the same kind of portion that is attributable to the blue or imputed payment period. If the student had withdrawn before that disbursement had happened but had actually entered the second loan period, unlike the last example, you would still use it as aid that could have been dispersed in the calculation, but you would be able to disperse it to them if they were eligible for that late post-withdrawal disbursement. That's the difference. Because the student actually entered that loan period, they've begun earning those loan funds, so to speak. So you could make a post-withdrawal disbursement if they're eligible. Something else we don't know the answer to. Do you like this? I'll give you all the stuff we don't know. In addition to what we do know, is that we talk about using aid dispersed for that proportional period, but when you made that disbursement October 26th, it's for the first half of that loan. So it includes some of that orange that goes beyond the blue payment period. Exactly, what do we do with that? I am inclined to suggest that that should be aid that could have been dispersed, but that you would not be able to disperse. But we don't know, it is another unknown. There are a lot of unknowns here, and I'm sorry for that. On behalf of the department, I apologize to you. All I heard was, can you show me a hand? I'm sorry. Oh, thank you. I didn't know where to look. Am I in the officer corps or enlisted? Schools were my academy. Do you want to talk about this? Do you want to run from the room? Which? Run? You want to run? In a way, I mean, if there's any logic that I think we can apply to that, it is just that, one, we're always looking at that blue or imputed or Pell payment period, whatever you would like to call it, as what you're using in that payment period or 2T4 calculation. So that is one very key point. Those are the payment periods you're going to be looking at when you're performing the calculation. When you're dealing with these kind of misaligned loan periods in that context, it just means you're looking at anything that would be attributable to that blue payment period, the end. So there is actually some logic here. This just involves a little bit more math than what we had talked about last year. Yes. There was a lot in there, so I'm going to try to repeat pieces and then correct me if you want to add. Will there be guidance forthcoming? I don't know. Last year when we were talking about this, there was guidance forthcoming. It was not forthcoming until the 16-17 handbook was published, which was not what we were expecting at the time. We thought it would come much sooner. We do not know what happens if you, and I was afraid someone was going to ask that, but I'm glad you did. If you are a school that does R2T4 calculations by period of enrollment, not payment period. I would like to assume the same principles apply, but in this case, we're really just talking about payment periods here. If a school were to switch, though I would never recommend that midstream, and I might have to ask you to repeat that question about switching. Oh, no, that would be fine, yes. All right, I will see if I can answer that for you. To reiterate, you can have a policy when you're dealing with R2T4 calculations, whether you want to use payment period or academic year, or period of enrollment. That is your choice, and when you have a transfer student, you can choose to treat them differently than a regular entering student that did not transfer. So that is an option. It does mean they might come in, have a period of enrollment, and then you might be switching in a second year. This is kind of what you're getting at. So that come that second year, you're looking at payment period basis. As far as I know, it would never change. It would always be driven by when that student started. It could still be an overlapping situation. SAP will be generally tied, depending, with the clock hour program, of course, you have some choices as to what point in time you do choose, but assuming you'd say if you're doing SAP reviews at the time of scheduled hours, so when they would be scheduled to complete half the hours and half the weeks, this would be tied to the blue period. You can always do more reviews if you want, but you would not have to add on SAP reviews because of these different, the SAP rules fortunately did not change. You would not be required to use Pell for what? I'm sorry? For SAP, no, because it will always be driven by, again, whether they've scheduled to complete half the hours and half the weeks, or they completed half the hours and half the weeks, or what have you, successfully completed half the hours, half the weeks, whatever those options are, but it's still always going to be driven by the half the hours, half the weeks, based on when they started. So Pell. Pell or imputed Pell. Yeah. Hopefully I repeated those enough so that they're audible to all of you and made sense to all of you. Any other questions before we close out? I will pull up the usual resource screen. Hopefully more resources to come since we have some unknowns. Did you have a question, Paul?
I think it was, could you go back to, I think it was question 39, slide 39.
It's like question 39?
Yeah. Go one more.
40
38.
or 38?
That one.
Okay.
I was under the impression, or there was guidance, where if a student was eligible for more than the 583, they could actually be dispersed. And that was the confusion when this first came out, was in theory there were students where they didn't get dispersed anything at the other school. They had a short loan period and they get 3,500 for like 300 hours of a clock hour program, and then have 600 hours left, and you would prorate 600 divided by 900 times 3,500, and if you put both amounts together that they would be eligible for, it'd be more than a normal student within the program, or is that something?
As to the best of my knowledge, we're sticking with the never more than the maximum that I don't want to say normal student, but a non-transfer student would be receiving.
So it's whatever that maximum amount is, that's what you're...
If we have a very short abbreviated loan period, again, if someone could give them a lot of loan for that period, but probably they shouldn't be. if they're actually packaging for that tiny loan.
You had short loan periods with a lot less, with more eligibility than normal. And according to the regulations, you would disperse $2,000, like maybe in this case $2,000, to end the prior academic year, and then the student would be eligible based on the proration of whatever amount of hours was left. But you're saying that they can't get more than 2333 no matter what.
What you're describing would be true if this program were not shorter than an academic year to begin with. And that is really why we're capping it out, because if we did follow that, we would follow it, and I'm not going to find the example now. Oh no, this would be an example. Because it is a one-year program, so we would never be subject to proration in this case. You're only having to prorate here because they have a remaining portion of study, but the program was at least a year. Yeah, the difference is that the actual program is prorated in this case, so you're starting from a lower starting point anyway. Here, that student would have 3,500, 3,500, 3,500, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes?
I'm finding flags for initial students who have no loan history. Is that in my software, or is there something?
What type of flag?
Loan limits,
Oh, really?
whether it's aggregate or,
But you're not actually seeing a history
yeah.
in NSLDS. I would actually recommend contacting NSLDS, because that, if you are seeing that, then there is obviously evidence of some kind of technical issue.
So it's with NSLDS rather than COD, you think?
Probably. They might always route you over. I guess that's always possible, but because those things are based on history, I would think NSLDS would be the place. Thank you. And I didn't get to say too, if anyone, thank you. If anyone does want to follow up on any of the things that I couldn't answer for you today, because we don't know, this is how you can reach out to me. I know we already lost a lot of people, but for those of you who don't know me, I am oddly, at least for the time being, one of your assigned training officers for the Boston region, the New York region, and the Chicago region. There are not many training officers left. So if any of you are in any of those regions, I am actually your training officer anyway, so you can contact me. You can always talk about me here. If you choose to do that, please evaluate me, not the missing guidance. And don't forget too that these session evaluations are actually in your app. If you have the FSATC 2016 app. In any case, thank you so much for coming. Have a great rest of the conference and afternoon.